Today on Hands On Photography, we're going to take a closer look at your photography, as in macro. Yes, I've already spoken about macro photography, but today we have a guest on the show, and it's Mr. Don Komarechka, the master of macro photography. Oh, this is going to be packed with a lot of information. Y'all check it out.
This is TWiT. No ads, just the content. That's what you get when you join Club TWiT. You even get extras like TWiT Plus, our new bonus feed just for members, and exclusive access to the Club TWiT Discord community. Join now for just $7 a month and support TWiT as we continue to create top-notch podcasts you expect and deserve. We're just getting started, so be one of the first to join as we build Club TWiT from the ground up. You could be an early member. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit to learn more and sign up now. Thanks.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, and this is Hands On Photography here on TWiT TV. Hope y'all are doing well. I am unbelievable as always. On this podcast, I love to sit down and share with you different tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer and a better post-processor. And every now and then I get the privilege and the honor and joy of being able to sit down with some amazing photographers from all over the world. And this week is one of those weeks. I have someone that I can actually call a friend. Yeah, I can call this man a friend because I can pick up my phone and give him a call and just chit chat and have nothing to do with photography. I'm talking about the one and only, the mad scientist, the premier macro photography master, Mr. Don Komarechka. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing well, Ant. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's been too long. I really wish that we could be sitting together right now in person. But
well, we're sitting together on the screen, right? We're still sitting together on the screen.
And the topic that you chose is perfect for us doing it in this format. So what are we talking about this week?
Hey, today, man, we're going to talk about some good old macro photography because I've done a macro photography tutorial way back when. Mr. Victor will put it up on the screen here, the 2 episodes where we talked about it. But I knew shooting that in the back of my head, I can't explain this the way Mr. Dom Com can, because, I mean, again, you're the mad scientist. You're the man when it comes to macro photography. And then I just saw that you finally got your book done, completed, shipped out the door. And you know what? I got to tell you, folks, he even sent me one. Oh, my goodness. That smell.
The new book smell.
I've missed this. This is The Universe at Our Feet, Macro Photography, The Universe at Our Feet, the latest and greatest book from Mr. Dom Com. And it's just well done. The images in it are just blows me away. And you get into so much detail on this stuff. I mean, it's literally like going to a reference manual if you're trying to get into photography. You mind sharing a few moments about your book and the process? And because dude, that again, that should be a reference manual, in my opinion.
It's a tome of knowledge, if nothing else. The book is 384 pages, just under 90,000 words, and hundreds of images along the way, covering pretty well every area of macro photography, from equipment selection and technique through the kinds of subjects that might be useful for you to photograph and exactly how you approach them and what pitfalls you'll find along the way through an entire post-processing workflow. And we're going to be talking about part of that post-processing workflow on this episode, specifically focus stacking, which is a technique that some people shy off on because it feels like there's a lot of technical stuff that's required to get it right. Mm-hmm. But you'd be surprised how simple it can be and approachable it can be when you're just getting started in macro photography, or you're a seasoned professional and there's ways to streamline that process.
Right. And see, in my session about macro photography, that was the second thing that I touched on was, all right, so you have this super high resolution image that's, everything is up close and in your face, but because of the depth of field, sometimes things are going to get soft here and you're going to have to try to figure out how to focus things up together to make that image even better. And I walked through just a quick way of trying to stack things up and use layer mask and Photoshop and make things just look a lot better. But you have some different tools. You have some tools that you rely on that really make these images pop and you're going to show us some of that stuff today, right?
We're going to do that right now. In fact, I'm going to start things off with the image that I used as the cover for my new book, called Essence of Reverie. And I do want to start with a behind the scenes image of that. And so I brought up a behind the scenes shot here that shows how that image was made. And then I'll show you the components that went into it. And then the focus stacking process and how you can get along with it. So this is just I don't know if it's a casserole dish or something. I bought it at the thrift store for $2 because it had a nice flat base, and I could fill it to the brim with water.
Yep.
And inside, submerged under the water, is a little third hand tool, a helping hand tool that has little alligator clips on a swivel, something that you might be familiar with if you've ever soldered anything together or fine jewelry work. We'll use those tools. I use them all the time for macro. And there's a little wildflower seed here. This is a prairie smoke wildflower, but clematis seeds would function much the same. And in behind that is placed some type of daisy-like flower, a version of osteospermum, I believe. But this is like shoestring putting it together. There's an overturned coffee cup as an ingredient in how this shot comes together. So it's not terribly advanced in the equipment. And what I'm doing to take the picture is I'm hand holding the camera and physically moving forward and backward ever so slightly to change my focus.
Wait a minute. You're hand holding this, dude?
It's handheld, and I'll show you some of the component images that go into that. Here's a sequence of, I think, 18 separate frames. Now, I would have used more than 18 frames, or shot more than 18, but I go through and I choose only the ones that I need based on where the focus is going to be.
Right.
So in a single frame, you'll notice that, I do have stuff in focus, but I got a lot of stuff out of focus too.
Right.
And if I click on another image in this set, well, my focus has shifted to be, up in this area, but, it still doesn't have this tip of this curve here nice and in focus. And so if I continue along that way, I'll find one that, it's got those parts in focus, and every one has a slightly different point of focus along the way. Now, in order to combine these together, there is special software to do it. And we'll touch on that at the very end of this episode with a different image. But in this case, I just use Photoshop. Photoshop, most people will have access to already.
Yep.
And it's very easy to start this out. So what you'll do is you'll just click on your whole series of images, just kind of shift click. So you got them all sorted out there on your film strip.
Yep.
And if you were to right click on that and choose Edit In, do not choose Edit in Photoshop, because that's going to open up 18 separate images.
Right.
You'll choose the very bottom option as Open as Layers in Photoshop. So they'll all open up in exactly the same space. Now, I've pre-done this along the way so that we don't have to watch progress bars complete. I already have that queued up right here, which along the side here, I've got all of my layers. And you'll also want to, at this point, make sure that you have them all selected. And once you've got all of your layers selected here, under the Edit menu, Photoshop has an Auto Align Layers feature. And Auto Align Layers, you're just going to let it do its auto magic. It's going to shift things left, right, up, down, rotate, correct for any perspective issues, because if you were moving around, your perspective to the subject is going to change.
Right.
And Photoshop does a really good job, better than most other programs, of handling this handheld approach for focus stacking. Because if I didn't align things and I just clicked through the images, then you might notice that they're out of alignment, right? Things shift around a little bit, sometimes quite a bit, but enough to completely mess you up if you were trying to focus stack things directly. So you would just let it churn through that. Depending on how fast your computer is, will take you a different amount of time, but I've pre-done that.
Right.
So I've gone ahead, let the computer do that work, and here we are coming into the step 2 for this process. If Photoshop decides to actually cooperate. There we go. Okay. So I got a lot of big files open at the moment. You can see all the edges here are all now sort of misaligned because the subject is aligned, not the edges of the frame.
Right.
And with this kind of stuff, you're always going to want to crop in afterwards once we're done the next part of the process. But the next step would be to, and there's a couple of tricks here, but the simplest way would be under the Edit menu again, Auto Blend Layers. So auto blend layers will have two options in here. Panorama and stack images. If they overlap almost entirely, it will default to stack images. If you've got a couple of them that are like way out in left field, like I do have one at the bottom that's kind of gone a bit of astray, it might default to panorama. Just make sure stack images is clicked. The default is seamless tones and colors. You do not want the content-aware fill, the transparent areas. That'll just fill in the extra gaps in the outer edges. We don't care about that. We're cropping in on it anyhow.
Right.
Don't do more work than you have to.
Right. I love content-aware fill, but it totally has no use right here.
Exactly, because we're going to have some weird artifacts in the edges if we don't kind of crop in to where there's a complete overlap of every frame. So once you do that, and again, this I'm doing this on a Surface Book 3, which is not a bad computer, but it doesn't have a lot of horsepower. I'm not going to let you watch 30 minutes of a progress bar completing to see how that kind of comes together. But right out of the gate, what you're going to get is something that is what I consider about 80% of the way there. It's not perfect. And, you know, to I guess a novice, you might think that it's absolutely phenomenal because it jumps right into focus all across the way. But there are a few issues that we would notice if we were to zoom in. I mean,
Dom, that's just so crispy. Oh,
it is. It's great, isn't it? And that's just automatic processing right there. You will notice if you have a dust spot on your sensor with the realigning of things,
right.
You'll see that in the bottom portion of the image here, there's a dust spot that has replicated itself because it was an area of technically detail.
Gotcha.
And so that kind of jumps in. But that's just the automated process of how you can get really clean, crisp results. There is a more detailed process that I'll go into with another image. A snowflake image, actually, which is a more technical process. Again, I shoot them handheld too. But if I were to go back into to Lightroom, I have a particular snowflake that was one of the most beautiful that I had seen this past year. And
wow.
So it kind of comes in slices, just like the water droplet image would, although it's more noticeable, the focus slice across the surface of a snowflake. Now, this is a much bigger stack. The average for a snowflake I might photograph is between 30 and 50 separate images.
Oh, wow.
This is a collection of 87 separate photographs combined together. And
what makes you have to stack so many for a snowflake when a snowflake is the size of a needlehead? What makes you have to get so many images? The
smaller things get, the shallower your depth of field becomes.
Right.
And the thing about these particular images, if I choose a slightly different slice along the way, you'll notice that there's reflected light coming off the surface of this particular crystal. It gives depth and dimension to it. But in order to get that, I would have to have, if the snowflake was completely flat, parallel to the focal plane, then the light source reflecting off the surface of the snowflake would have to come at that same angle, which would theoretically have to be coming from the same angle as coming from inside the lens. Okay. And that's not really feasible. Yeah. So they have to be photographed on a slight angle such that the angle of incident equals the angle of reflection, and you get glare off of a window, but in this case, it's off of a snowflake. And it really brings up that crystal structure, making it shine and sparkle, and it's beautiful. But it means you can only get a tiny sliver in focus at any given time because you're photographing it on an angle, and these things are maybe a couple of millimeters across. The biggest ones I photographed like this might measure a centimeter. And so they're tiny. They are tiny little things, but they're beautiful, and it's helpful to see what they end up looking like in their completeness. You might notice a few things about this image. In the background, you'll see some little fibrous bits. The background for every one of these snowflakes is a homemade black mitten. It offers a dark contrasty background. It usually lifts the snowflake away from the background so that you have a cleaner background, and it functions as an insulator so that it doesn't melt on contact because it's not pressed right up against something. So I would do the exact same thing. You would right click on these images, you'd go edit in, and you would choose open as layers in Photoshop.
Nice.
Now, with this many layers, and this is a 47 megapixel image, you're probably going to want to like go take the dog for a walk before you come back.
Right.
But I should have mentioned, I'm kind of stealing my thunder. This was the completed image of the first one we were looking at. I wanted to show, just the subtle adjustments and color corrections and what have you. Thank you. But when we get into that snowflake process, it's very much the same. Handheld macro photography can easily be done in Photoshop. However, when you get up to the 80-something images, your Photoshop kind of breaks down a little bit because Photoshop has to throw everything up into active memory in order to compute it. Right. Dedicated software like Zareen Stacker, and we'll be looking at Helicon Focus in a minute. They handle things differently. They kind of churn through one image at a time, align it to the previous ones, and then carry on to the next. So it's much less resource intensive. But because they're not looking at the whole thing at once, their alignment for handheld images doesn't really hold up as well as Photoshop would.
Gotcha.
We're back here in Photoshop, and we've loaded up all of the 87, my goodness, images in the layers panel. So if anything makes Photoshop weep and cry, it's going to be this. But one thing that I want you to notice right away is that this first frame, you've got so little in focus in the foreground, this tiny little branch here at the bottom, but also notice how wonderfully smooth the background is. Yeah. Aside from one or two little pieces that I'd have to clone out, the background of these images can be easily cleaned by taking the one image that is furthest away from the background and using a layer mask and painting that in manually as part of the next process. But Beautiful. What we would do is same as we did before, select all of our layers, make sure that everything's good to go, and then we would go edit, auto align layers. And again, let Photoshop just work its magic. Again, you went to walk the dog. Now you got to go make yourself a sandwich and come back because this can take some time. We'll save step 2 because we saw that in the first one where we would then go ahead and auto blend the layers once things are aligned. And we'll jump right into that final result. But in this version, there's going to be something that's really important to consider in terms of fixing and correcting little defects that might come up along the way, including the background. So it's very important that we take an extra step. That step is before we auto blend, we duplicate our layer stack. You just right click on the layers and you click duplicate. Okay. And that'll create 2 separate sets. One set I distill down once I blend it. So I blend one set down into a final composite like this. Yep. And you can see that as layer 1 here. That is my completed Photoshop's focus stacked version. But I still have all of the individual component pieces that went into the image. And so if something isn't quite right, if Photoshop's algorithms weren't as accurate as I would have liked them to be, or the background needs to be cleaned up, I have the original source material perfectly aligned to the end result here that I can go in using layer masks and paint in corrections for. Typically, I'll take this, I'll call it a foundation layer, and I'll take that and I'll just bring it right to the bottom of the layer stack, all the way down. It's got a lot of layers it's got to go through in this particular one. And then I would, as painstaking as it might be, I would go through every single layer. I turn off the visibility of every layer going up, and you can just click and drag and turn off that visibility pretty easily through all those layers. And then I'd go through every single one of them from the bottom up. Oh, boy. Anybody that's worked with layers know that they're hierarchical. So if you find a better fix to a problem you had at a lower level, it'll supersede it. Yep. But I'll just take that first top image here because you can see the background is really nice and clean in this particular case. So if we click on this top layer and I create a layer mask, then I can paint it on or off. Now it starts when you create a layer mask, it's on by default. You can press Alt or Option click and invert it, but just press Control I and flip it over. And then that will hide it. But now I can take a brush And I typically use it with a fairly, soft hardness of 0%. And I can paint in areas that I want from this layer that benefit the overall image. And so I can just paint over all of those fibers that I just don't want. It gets a bit tricky when you get super close to the edges. And so you might have to start cloning out the most extreme close details because of the way focus stacking works. When something is out of focus, it technically goes a bit beyond its edges. But you can go in and fairly easily clean up the backgrounds of just about any image that has cluttered backgrounds that you just want something to behave a little bit better with.
I'm sure you zoom in from time to time too, right?
Oh, I would be doing this
edges.
entirely zoomed in.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of giving you the cursory view of how I might go about handling some of these. And it's not going to be perfect, but it is going to help you a considerable amount of the way when it comes time to clean things up. If I were to zoom in on this and take a look at certain areas of the image, they're not perfect. There's little kind of three-dimensional areas of the snowflake that jump right out of the surface.
Okay.
And Photoshop doesn't handle that really well. There's also a mitten fiber that's kind of coming through there. So I'd have to get friendly with my clone tools to remove that, to clean that up. If I were to choose any random layer in the inside of the image here, maybe something a little bit closer towards the center, you might be able to illustrate how some of these details might be.
Wow.
So something like this here. You can see these details, especially this one little area that's jumping right up out.
Right.
If I were to create a layer mask on that and invert it, you'll notice that Photoshop didn't do a great job in that region, right? Because it's focusing more on what's in the background, and you have two layers of detail at two different depths, and Photoshop it kind of guesses, and it doesn't always do a perfect job. So I can go and I can start painting those details back in as I see fit. And it's a painstaking job. As I mentioned before, this is, it's like knitting a sweater. Once you figured out the technique, it's like muscle memory, right? It doesn't take a whole lot for you to do it technically, but it just takes time in order to smooth out all of those little details, like this little piece down here comes back into focus in there. The finesse required all depends on how much time you want to spend on it. This particular
looks painful, Mr. Domcom. This looks so painful.
It looks fine if you're viewing it from afar, and if you're fine with that, then I'm envious of you, because I end up working a little bit further and harder to make sure that these things are pristine and perfect. The final result for that image.
I have a question for you though. So as you're working on this with such precision and detail, are you a mouse user, or are you more of a Wacom tablet user or a Wacom
I
Cintiq?
use a mouse. This is all done with a mouse.
Wow.
I found it to be easier when I'm just kind of clicking a little dab here and there to paint something in, that a mouse on a particular layer has the precision that I want. And this is the finished image once I've brightened stuff up, applied some texture enhancement and so on to get that. And
look at that.
I'm happy with it. It takes a while to get there, but that is a handheld image run through Photoshop as the only tool for focus stacking.
Looks like the Star Crystals website.
Yeah. So if you go to my website at, I've got a few of them, but at skycrystals.ca.
Sky Crystals, not Star Crystals.
Skycrystals.ca. You can find a lot of example snowflake images, and that's also where you can buy my new book. But I do want to talk about one other element of macro photography, focus stacking, and that's when you are buttoned down on a tripod, when your subject is static, and it can be anything from a specimen, like I've got some butterfly wings, and I'll show an example of that in a little bit, or it could be a mineral, could be a flower. Keep in mind, flowers are not as static as you think, though. They do actually move and bend, and if you pick them, they'll start to wilt during a shoot.
Right.
So, there might be some corrections required in the same way that you saw with that snowflake image. But I've got a number of focusing rails, which basically allow the camera to move. You stick your camera on it, and it's got a little, the manual ones will let the stage move forward and backward. And this is a Manfrotto 454. And that's a pretty rock solid one. You'd want it at least being solid metal.
Yeah.
But to be honest, if you're going to go that far, go automated. There's a number of companies that make automated focusing rails. Cognisys makes the stack shot. That's a fairly middle of the road one in terms of price, but it's very, very flexible. I've used it for many years. I think WeMacro has one that's even more affordable, though I haven't used that. You can go to the high end, and I just absolutely love the NovoFlex Castel Micro. Super expensive.
I've heard you talk about that NovoFlex.
This one, I mean, I'm not showing you the control box that comes along with these automated ones, but it's not as flexible as the stack shot in terms of the stack shot can do photogrammetry with a rotational platform. It's got all sorts of bells and whistles and a Bluetooth remote control if you wanted to buy it. This one's got none of that, but it's the best in terms of just getting one thing done right. But it's also like 1,800 euro. So law of diminishing returns, it is the best, but you got to pay orders of magnitude more to get there.
And when you talk about the controllers with these, is it just a simple corded remote with a few dials, or what
it's usually a box that's, I don't know, maybe 6 inches square that has a touch screen on it.
Okay.
And so you can kind of program exactly where the camera starts, where the camera stops, how many shots you want to take in between, and just let the camera go. It'll automatically trigger the camera at every step of the way.
Oh, that's so cool.
And so it's super convenient, and it results in some very interesting images, especially because they're all in sequence and they're relatively all aligned. You can use other software to handle this as well. And one of those software programs that I've used quite a bit of is Helicon Focus. Mm-hmm. And I've prepared an image here that was just, we were churning through the numbers on this moments ago. Let's bring up a file explorer and just drag and drop them into this window here from my desktop, which you will see momentarily. I prepared just for this example because this is going to be a 991 image stack.
Oh, my goodness.
And I had to scale these down to low-res JPEGs in order to actually do this in semi-real time so that we can see what's going on here. Helicon Focus has 3 methods. Method A, which is weighted average. I've never used it successfully for anything. Method B, which is depth map, and method C, which is pyramid. Those are the 2 that I use the most. And you might be able to change some settings on them. There's radius and smoothing settings. I just leave it at the default to start, see which one of them works the best, and just hit render. And Helicon Focus will start creating this map of all of the images. And you can see it just running through and building up a version of the photograph. And we might have to speed this up in editing. But if you've got, one of the things I love about this program is it will utilize your GPU. It will also utilize your every core that your computer has. So if you're using a crazy 32 core desktop, it will look and say, oh, 32 cores? Oh, look at that. There's 64 threads. I want it all.
Got them. Nice.
And it will use everything along the way.
Now, the settings that you have there, the radius and smoothing, I'm assuming that the radius is still more so with the sharpening threshold, and the smoothing is more so for the edges after the sharpening, or?
Yeah, and it also has to do with how an image might sort of how the depth might change from one part to another, and how it might handle things like specular highlights and blooms of light that kind of come off of certain subjects.
Oh, okay.
So there's a number of factors to consider within there, and it's worth just tinkering and saying, okay, well, I'm going to run this once and then, jump on the treadmill for 5 minutes and come back and run it again and again and again and see what works and what doesn't. And but as you can see, it's running through. It's about halfway through the image stack now, and then this is pass number 1 of method B, and then as soon as it hits the end, it goes through a second pass where it builds the entire image, and so it's creating a 2-step process. And I'm not really sure exactly. I should have talked to the engineers to figure out exactly what they're doing, because I'm the curious guy that's going to need that knowledge for some obscure thing. But suffice to say, there's no perfect focus stacking method. Every method has flaws. We saw some flaws in Photoshop that weren't perfect. There's a reason why Helicon Focus has 3 separate modes, because there's no such thing as a perfect one.
Right.
So now we can see it completing its second pass, and the final image just jumps out in complete focus. And that's looking pretty good. You'll see some weird artifacts on the edges. Again, you're going to crop in on those areas. That's where it had to do the auto aligning of things along the way. That method B of depth map worked pretty good. I would have tried this also with method C, but I do know just from past experience that it has all sorts of very strange blooms off of these highlights that wouldn't have worked so well with this particular image. But try them all to see what works. This wing of a Madagascan sunset moth was shot with a 20 times microscope objective, which is why I needed to use nearly 1,000 frames, photographed at an extreme angle to make it look like it's almost this sort of cascading waterfall of color off these scales here. When I do these types of experiments, Ant, it's personally for me, that's a moment of discovery. It's a moment of the world is so beautiful in a way that we can't normally see with our own eyes. And that's what macro photography really, truly is about for me. And at the smallest scale, there's always something more to see.
See, when I'm thinking of macro photography, I guess I'm oversimplifying it because I'm thinking of the definition of 1-to-1 when it's filling the frame, the 1-to-1 ratio. Right. But you just went, 20 times?
20 times. And, you can get closer. I've used 50 times microscope objectives and all that. I do want to share with you the final result, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Because I've got the finished image was here after I cropped it in and did all the little fix up works and, all the fine tuning adjustments, being a little fickle about color and contrast and texture and all that. But that is the finished piece once you just kind of give it that extra wave of Photoshop magic of cleanup and crispness, etc.
What's crazy is no one would know that this came off of a moth wing, or this is a moth wing. It's just sort of I don't know, is it innocuous, the word I'm looking for? Just beautiful patterns, beautiful specular highlights and amazing detail. And it just gets your attention. You don't care what it is. It's just beautiful piece of art.
Just a fun little bit of science to throw in there. These butterflies, as well as many others, use optical interference within structures in the scales of their wing themselves in order to generate color. It's not the standard absorbing some colors and reflecting others. The ones that are reflected are the ones that you see. They cause light to interfere with itself. That causes destructive interference and constructive interference to make some colors diminished and other colors brighter, which is why when you see them on an angle and that structure is bending, the colors change because the structures are hitting the light at a different angle.
Right.
And that's where the magic is. When you get into macro photography, you just want to figure things out. It's such a joy to understand the world on a greater scale or a smaller scale. In this case, no pun intended, being butterfly or moth scales.
Dude, this is just unbelievable. Undaggum believable. I want to say thank you, but I don't know if that's enough. This is just, you've blown my mind. Again, I've oversimplified macro photography, and my apologies to you and other macro photographers out there. There's so much more to this world. And as you put it here in your book, the universe essentially is what we're getting access to as we get closer and closer, and being able to capture this with whatever camera that we have. It's just, every now and then you can throw in some additional tools with it, right?
Absolutely. And especially with this type of photography, you're pushing up against the limits of physics. You cannot choose a smaller aperture to overcome this depth of field problem because diffraction is going to blur the heck out of all of your results.
Right.
And so you have to find more novel ways to get the detail that you want when you simply cannot get it in a single photograph. That's where my favorite type of computational photography comes in: focus stacking.
Beautiful, beautiful, and so on point, Mr. Don Com. I call him Doncom, folks, because that's what his Twitter handle is, and it's a lot easier for me to say his last name that way. But
I can also be found at doncom.ca as the URL too. You don't have to spell out my last name; doesn't matter.
It's all in love. Trust me, it's all in love. But again, Mr. Doncom, thank you so much for joining me this week on the show. This has just been tremendous. Just so much information. I'm going to have to come back and watch this a couple more times as I try to step up my knowledge in the world of macro photography. And I'm sure all of our other hands-on photography listeners feel the same way. But before we go, I wanted to allow you the opportunity to plug a couple things that you've been working on, such as your book, as well as any other upcoming projects and things that you may have on the horizon.
Right. So my book, as you mentioned, Macro Photography, The Universe at Our Feet, which is thick, right? I mean, this is a massive book. It weighs more than 4 pounds. It's tricky to ship these things out. It's almost like a weapon. But yeah, there's a whole section on the snowflakes and everything else and how you can get the detail. Even, heck, you want to photograph micrometeorites? It's in here. You want to use microscope objective? It's in there as well. You want to shoot with stereoscopic 3D equipment? And this section of the book actually comes with anaglyph red-blue glasses. It's in there too.
Oh, man.
So there's a lot of fun to be had with that. But I also want to mention my podcast.
That's
Photo
right.
Geek Weekly. That
show, that podcast, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that podcast, I listen to it every week, Photo Geek Weekly. And TWiT listeners, geek, he takes that term to the extreme with regards to photography. I just listened to a recent episode and he's breaking down the wavelength of light. Breaking it down.
To be fair, this is something that could benefit us all in technology we use on a regular basis, because once you understand what these crazy new inventions are, it could improve the camera in your smartphone. It could improve the way that they design lenses in any point and shoot camera. Super zoom cameras could become much more zooming than they currently are, or telephoto optics could shrink. This is all what we talked about on the last episode as we're recording this, which was episode 150. But there are similarly geeky discussions in every episode at photogeekweekly.com.
Outstanding. And where can we get your book?
You can get my book at my website at skycrystals.ca. That's named after my first book on snowflakes, and I'm just piggybacking off of the e-commerce setup that I built there. If you're curious why the URL doesn't really match the name of the book, but skycrystals.ca is where you can grab a copy either in physical form or digital versions as well.
Outstanding. Again, my man, thank you so much for joining me this week. I've been wanting to have you on for quite a while, but I know you've been busy, so I wasn't sweating you too much. And I wanted to say that I think the message that I sent to you to get you on was like, okay, now that the book is done, can you come give me a shout?
And here we are.
I love it. Thank you again, my man. It's really good to see you.
My pleasure. I hope everybody enjoyed. And if anybody has any questions, just type my name into Google and ask away. I'd be happy to fill in any blanks for you.
Outstanding. All right, folks, that is going to do it for this week's episode. Wow. I think I have a little bit of exhaust coming out of my ears because there's just so much processing going on in my head with all of that information and knowledge that was shared. And it's just totally awesome information. Thank you so much to my man, Mr. Dom Komarechka. And thank you to all of you, the Hands-On Photography listeners, for joining me each and every week here on the show. And again, if this was your first time catching us, just, hey, go ahead and subscribe now that you're here. And we're available on pretty much any podcast application that's out there. And if you just have questions about our subscription options, you can easily just go to our website, twit.tv/hop. That's twit.tv/HOP for Hands-On Photography, where you'll see all of our previous shows and the show notes, especially for shows like this one today. It's going to be a lot of show notes in there and a lot of different references for you to click on and check out to further dive into this particular episode. And if you got a minute, give me a review and a rating on all of the different podcast applications that support that. It really does help us out and helps push us up in the ratings so other folks can enjoy the show and help grow the Hands-On Photography community. So thank you again. And yeah, you can also shoot me an email if you want to send some feedback, have some questions, comment, image critiques. That's hop hop@twit.tv. Again, that email address is hop@twit.tv. And you can follow me over on the social medias. I am Ant_Pruitt on Twitter. And I'm also Ant_Pruitt on Instagram. Give me a shout there. I love hearing from you folks. All right. I'm going to let you all go. Thank you again for the tremendous support. And thank you again to my man, Mr. Victor, for making me look and sound good as always. And we will see you all next time here on Hands On Photography. So now safely create and dominate, and we'll catch you next time. Y'all take care.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you are interested in checking out all things smart home and Internet of Things, then you should check out Smart Tech Today, the podcast I, Micah Sargent, do with my co-host Matthew Casanelli. It's all about the smart home and improving your automations.